Hello, and welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host, and this is a very special episode. First, it will be the last episode in what I suppose is a season of the podcast show. I'm going to take a little bit of a summer break and into the early fall, as I did last year, to regroup, deal with some issues that I have to, and clear my head. It is also a very special episode because of the guest and the conversation that we have. As you will see, she is someone who's particularly adept at different media and experiments with different genres, and turned out to be a pretty spectacular guest for a podcast. More on that later. I was thinking about how to introduce today's discussion, and my thoughts turned to a hilarious science fiction novel by John Scalzi called Red Shirts. This is about the crew of a spaceship that in most ways resembles the Enterprise from the TV show Star Trek. Only it's not the main characters, it's the people in the lower decks, as it were. And as they go about their post on this ship and they do their duties, they realize that the main the officers on the ship at certain times start to behave in very strange ways. It's almost as if they suddenly lapse into a script, and they start speaking and acting in very dramatic ways. There are dramatic pauses, all kinds of exciting things happen, people die. And the reference in the title of the book, Red Shirts, is to the sort of auxiliary characters who show up in many episodes of the Star Trek series, who are there to die in the initial moments of an encounter in order to show that it is serious and that the main characters are in jeopardy. And so these crewmen realize that their lives are in danger every time, quote, the narrative takes over. And they don't know how this is happening and why. I won't give the book away, and it's a fun read. You should definitely read it. But they realize that they are essentially living in a script that's being written for a TV show, and it involves all kinds of time travel and spatial dimensions and things like this. Anyway, we don't need to get into that. What's interesting about the storytelling aspect of the novel is the contrast between the day-to-day lives that these people live, which are normal, well, insofar as anything in literature can be normal, but, within normal human parameters, and what happens when the narrative or the script takes over. This reminds me of something that happens in historical studies, too. In other words, there's a way in which we as historians and scholars engage with the people of the past in their particular circumstances based on the specific information that we have about their lives that is normally not very dramatic or exciting, that is not necessarily governed by huge abstractions, that in many ways is interchangeable with the lives of people who lived at the same time, even in other cultures, on the one hand. And on the other hand, what happens when we understand certain civilizations through abstractions such as Byzantium and the Renaissance? Because those abstractions are not necessarily composed of the aggregation of all the individual bits of information that we have about this and that. They are, in fact, abstractions that stem from a narrative about how history played out. And specifically, this is a narrative that, for those two civilizations, is of Western manufacture and largely modern, and I would argue in many respects kind of 19th century. So there is a big narrative, a script, if you will, about the kind of meaning of history, right, from antiquity through the Middle Ages. And the Renaissance and Byzantium are characters in that narrative. They are there to represent specific kinds, sort of specific moments and clusters of values that are meaningful to the people telling the narrative of Western civilization, especially in the 19th and 20th centuries. And it is in this sense that we can say that Byzantium and the Renaissance are invented categories. This is not to say that those societies didn't exist, that the people that we're talking about, whether Michael Psellus or Michelangelo, didn't exist and they didn't generally do the things that we know that they did. It's just that when we put them into the context of those civilizations and we expect them to act as standard bearers for, they're carrying these banners that make sense in a bigger story, a whole lot of distortions come in. So if you were to do a quick response to the words Byzantium and the Renaissance, especially in the way in which they exist in the popular imagination, the short list would include certain characteristics and values and qualities and traits of those civilizations and what they mean for us, and are they, deviant, or are they moments of great progress for Western civilization or whatever, and you will quickly realize how those civilizations have been turned into characters in a grander narrative. So, for example, I still have colleagues who assert to me confidently and, without really being willing to consider exceptions, that the Byzantines never really understood the true spirit of classical Greek texts, and that they read them solely for lexicographical and grammatical purposes in order to practice their ancient Greek, Greek prose comp, and never really engaged with the content of those texts or grasped, their meaning. And when I hear these statements, I'm wondering, well, how can you possibly know this? In order to know this, you need to have read all of Byzantine literature, to have detected in it all instances of engagement with classical texts, to have, burrowed into them deeply enough to know that they don't go very deeply and that there's nothing really here to see folks move along, and that you have also read all scholarship that claims that there's actually a close and serious engagement with classical texts in those, and to then have refuted that scholarship in every single instance in order to make that conclusion. And this is just impossible. It's impossible for anyone to have done this, and I know that it hasn't been done. And so I'm just left with the suspicion that that claim is just part of the narrative. It's been around since possibly the 16th century. It is very strongly asserted in Gibbon in the 18th century, and it's just been part of it's a staple claim that is made in connection with, quote, Byzantium. And in this regard, Byzantium plays a role in the narrative that's like antithetical to that of the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is this the contrast, right, where Italian humanists sort of rediscover the true spirit of antiquity, and, they revive it, and you get from there to democracy and capitalism or something like that. In this respect, as well as in others, the character Byzantium stands in a kind of antithesis to the character the Renaissance, and both of them are, actors on a stage that are where the play of Western history is being acted out. So, if in our field the effort over the past generation or more has been to save the people that we study from the shadow of this big abstraction that the narrative has cast over their lives, something similar happens in Renaissance studies, even though the polarities are there reversed, because the Renaissance is typically used as a shorthand for a good moment, and so its main characters have often been, burdened with the task of always representing the ideals of humanism, or you name it. And this is also not true to their lives necessarily, and certainly not to the entirety of the societies in which they lived and all of their relationships. And so even though the phenomenon, the problem, appears in its inverse form, it's still ultimately the same problem. And the idea for having a contrapuntal conversation on our two fields and the roles in which they play in the narrative formed inevitably in my mind when I saw and read my colleague at the University of Chicago, Ada Palmer's book, Inventing the Renaissance. Now, it is difficult to introduce Ada briefly, and I think that most of you will form an opinion of how she thinks from the actual conversation. But let me just say that the most impressive thing about her is that She is willing to think in several genres at the same time and to experiment with media. For example, in addition to rigorous scholarship on the Renaissance and Renaissance intellectual history, she's also an award-winning author of science fiction novels. This is in part why I was trying to find a science fiction novel to introduce this episode with that sort of hit the right themes, or at least I tried to make it seem that it does. And she's also a very innovative teacher, and some of her teaching techniques have actually been featured in the New York Times recently, specifically a mock papal election that she has students in a Renaissance class perform in full dress-up and in the Rockefeller Chapel at the University of Chicago, and it sounds like a glorious experience, actually, for the students, also for Ada herself, I'm sure. And she talks about it in the book, Inventing the Renaissance, too, so you get a sense of how she sets that up and what the goals are. And I just found that she's just a wonderful person in combining scholarship with a very acute awareness of the acts of imagination that we're always engaged in when we're doing scholarship, and how not to let those, how not to get carried away by them into sort of invented categories such as the Renaissance or Byzantium, and to kind of stay true to the very sometimes gritty reality of the people we're talking about, who weren't necessarily always the bearers of such abstractions. And I find that in our conversation, she was always engaged in these thought experiments that lay bare these kinds of assumptions that we're making in our imagination when we talk about history. It was a tremendous fun conversation, and I hope you enjoy it too. As I said, this will be the last one of the season. I will see you all again in the fall at some indefinite date. I don't know yet when. Thanks also to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Here's my conversation with Ada. Ada, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, pleasure to be here.
So before we get started, I have to say that a number of times before class begins, I've had students discussing your classes. Ada, you're making us all look bad.
Especially in April, I assume, when they can't shut up about the election simulation. It runs 24/7, but they lose the ability to discuss anything else. Their roommates and friends all go mad hearing about nothing but popes and cardinals for a month.
And this year you were featured in the New York Times specifically for that. Okay, this is a whole other topic that we can talk about. And I'm sure the audience is now intrigued. In fact, maybe, I'll put a link in the episode description.
Yeah, and I talk about that simulation in the book a bit.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I had to pick the topics I wanted to focus on here because there really is so much going on in the book. By the way, a bit of background. So when I was an undergraduate at Michigan, this is in the early 90s, I took a number of courses with Marvin Becker. I don't know if you know.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
At the time, he was in his mid-80s. He was this very tall, gaunt, very intimidating-looking person, but was very sweet. And he would just come to class. He was virtually blind by that point, and he would just talk about the Italian Renaissance, having spent, he said, something like 40 years in the Florentine archives. And I wanted to work with him. So there's a version of history where I did Renaissance studies, but he said, no, I mean, I'm 80 something, I'm blind, I'm not taking on students. So I'm like, well, okay. And there were also a bunch of people at Michigan who worked on late antiquity and Byzantium. And so I kind of drifted into that area. All right. So I've always kept, I sort of sideways glances at what's going on in Renaissance studies. So I was very excited to read your book. And I was intrigued by the title, of course, because as it happens, my field is going through its own invention phase. And I'm actually going to publish a book next year, which I would have called Invention of Byzantium had it not been for the fact that there already is a book with that title. Okay. So let's talk a little bit first about what it means to say that something like the Renaissance or Byzantium is invented. I mean, most people think that these are just things that just happened, that they existed, right? So what do you mean when you say the invention of the Renaissance?
I mean, it's easier to describe it for Renaissance and Byzantium because the short tell is if you ask people when the Renaissance begins and when it ends, and you ask them for actual dates, you get chaos, right? You know, there are some events that we can say definitely happened in a year, like the French Revolution. We can all point at some years and agree that this was a thing, it occurred, it had. We may disagree about how many phases it had and exactly when the first tremors are, etc. But you know, if it said if 1789, we all agree a thing was happening in France, right? But if I go out of my office door and I turn right and I head down to the English department and I ask them, when is the Renaissance? They'll say, well, the Renaissance is Shakespeare. So it's coming to its peak in 1600 with the debut of Hamlet. And it's really getting going by 1550, you know, which is the beginning of the peak of the Renaissance. And before that is just mostly medieval. But if I turn left down the same hallway and I go to the Renaissance people in, or just anybody in the Romance languages department, and I talk to the Italianists, and I say, when is the Renaissance? Oh, well, the Renaissance is Dante, so you know it's getting going at about 1250, and it's approaching its peak in the late 1300s, so that the pinnacle of it is 1400 to 1415, and then it sort of tapers off, and it's definitely ending by the 1510s. So the Renaissance is over at one end of the hallway when Shakespeare's grandparents haven't been born yet,
right?
For it to come to a peak at the other end of the hallway. So that tells you that this isn't very real, right? That this is a construction and a name that people have made for a very amorphous thing, much more amorphous than Byzantium, where there's a city that has a name that gives its name to a sphere of power around it, and there is an end date, that we can look at as a climax. So in important ways, Byzantium much more real than the Renaissance. But the Renaissance is invented around the idea that there is some transitional period when something started that made humans be different and made the human condition be different, that began a transformation which moved us from medieval to modern, and that something came in this zone that changed stuff that made us become the modern people we are now. So it's not actually about the Renaissance, it's about modernity and how you define modernity. And there are lots of different theories about what specific thing comes in. And as you know, in the book, I call this an X factor, right? That people will say this began and this sparked the change, and therefore this defines modernity. One of the popular theories will be that it's rational, secular thought, sort of proto-scientific movements and rejection of superstition. And it comes in and it awakens the mind that was sleepy before, and then science and stuff begin. And then that's what gets momentum going toward modernity. Another theory that you get is that it's the beginning of national identity and nation formation and the articulation of the nation state, and the sort of advent of modern nation state politics and the birth of nationalism that shapes what changes. There's another theory that it's banking and the invention of new ways of lending money at interest and exchanging currencies that enable the acceleration of trade, that make the first major exchange of commodities. And now, instead of processing your wool at home, England is exporting its wool to Italy and then processing it there and back. And the beginning of a sort of a current of international exchange parallel to what ancient Rome had, but that the Middle Ages had less of. And that therefore it's capitalism being born that is what makes the Renaissance happen. And you'll notice that each of these popular X factors can be turned into a claim that some political movement or social movement is the correct current of modernity, right? So the theory that the Renaissance is caused by banking and proto-capitalism is big during the Cold War, because you can use it to write a New York Times op-ed that says the West and our capitalist mode is the continuation of all the noble, wonderful things of the Renaissance, and the bad, no good, communal dark ages are what the communists are doing, right? So that you can use these X factors, not the historian, but the journalist who reads the book and is like, I'm going to write something for the journalistic audience, will transform this into a celebration of something that someone is claiming defines modernity. And this is really politically useful, right? You can use it
Yeah.
propagandistically to say my movement, my ideology, my political party, my candidate, my bank, my investment program, my startup company is going to do the thing that continues what caused the Renaissance. And whatever my rivals are doing is similar to the Dark Ages. And this is such a perennially useful framing for power and profit that no matter how many times historians come and say, actually, it's not very modern at all. And if you were there, you would be like, this is totally not modern. This is not similar to anything we're doing. These people are weirdos. Nobody wants that to be true. Everybody wants there to have been a golden age because it's very narratively satisfying and propagandistically useful. And so the whole lie that there was a dark age and a golden age, which is a lie, and every historian will tell you that there's not a dark age and there's not a golden age, that these are eras that have complicated qualities, but not one of them is better than the other one. They're just both complicated bunches of stuff that happened. But the idea of a golden age and a dark age is so narratively satisfying, right? And if I take off my historian hat for a moment and put on my sci-fi fantasy novelist hat, it's so satisfying to say, long ago there was a golden age with elf kings, and then there was a dark lord and a dark age, and then there was a second golden age when the tribunal of 5 god princes did a thing, and then there was another dark age. Like, it doesn't matter whether you're setting this in a fantasy world or in a space empire. It's very narratively satisfying for your backstory to involve there being a dark age and a golden age, because this idea of cycles of history makes sense to us. And that's why it's so hard for the historian to come into the room and say, by the way, there's never been any such thing ever. We made it up. Sorry, we were wrong. Because nobody wants that. Everyone likes the narratively satisfying ability to claim a golden age and a dark age and to be a continuation of or aspiring to another golden age.
Right. So my field finds itself on the opposite end of that logic.
Right, because the Byzantine Empire is what becomes decadent, right? The decadence empire, and then falls amid its jeweled and silk-filled chambers where decadence reigns, which is also made up, but is also narratively satisfying, and so therefore hard to combat. Right.
It's very often the example. It's the problem to be avoided, whereas yours is the golden age to be, you strive for. So here's an interesting distinction. All of these attempts to use the Renaissance in this manner, there's all of these institutions and interests are using the Renaissance in this way to make their argument, right? Ideologies as well, just, capitalism is just it's a sort of ideology.
Yep.
They all presuppose that this thing, this period, whatever it is good. It was a turn for the better, right, in human history. And it seems like they're all kind of drawing on a presupposition that this is a golden age. So I get the sense sometimes, like when I'm reading authors from the society you study, that they also kind of thought that, or were at least trying to make the case in some ways.
Also, yes-ish, but aspirationally, right?
Exactly. No. Entirely
this is where you have to break it down into chunks, because the real phases when we zoom in to the Renaissance and don't pretend that 300 years is one moment, admit that it's many, is at the beginning they're like, this is the apocalypse, everything is terrible. Everything got worse, we're on fire. We need to do something, let's imitate the ancients. And then there's okay, everybody, let's imitate the ancients. And then there's okay, we're imitating the ancients now. And it's in stage 3 that you get and therefore this is a golden age. But you get it in, prefaces of books dedicated to the Duke who just conquered the city, who you're trying to justify the tyranny of by comparing him to Augustus Caesar. And then you get the next one, which is, are we in a golden age now? These things are good. These things are not good. What's happening? And then they get wars that are worse. And then you're 100 years into the process of this and you hit 1500 and you have the Calamita d'Italia, these wars that get way worse than the wars were before. And then you have Machiavelli being there like, nope, not a golden age. Failed. We got to do another thing here because this is not working. All of which is, again, Machiavelli is dead when Shakespeare's grandparents are about to be born. So All this is the first half of what people who go all the way through Shakespeare and
Mm.
early 17th century would call Renaissance. But there very much is a sense of desperation, an effort to try to imitate Rome to make a golden age, then propagandistic constructions of this is definitely a golden age is the public facing, and the private facing is, are we in a golden
Right.
age?
Yep. Exactly. Exactly.
Oh, it's
Yes.
actually
Yeah.
happening.
Yeah.
Even as there's also the recognition of things getting worse. And you saw me quote that letter that is one of my favorite Renaissance letters, where a friend wrote to Machiavelli, who had just written half of a history of the decade that has 1500 in the middle of it, the decade that spans 1500. And Machiavelli had written the first half, and the friend wrote and said, Machiavelli, you must finish this history, because without a good history of this period, future generations will never believe how bad it was. And they will never forgive us for having lost so much so quickly.
Yeah.
Now, that is the decade in which Michelangelo carved the David, and Leonardo painted the Mona Lisa, and Raphael is
Yes.
frescoing
Yeah.
chapels, and Josquin des Prez is composing the polyphonic music that gets celebrated as the birth of the beginning of high
Mhm.
Renaissance music. All of this is happening in a decade that, for those living on the ground, felt like no future era could ever believe how bad it was. And indeed, we don't believe how bad it was, because what do we see as we go to the museum, and there's a Michelangelo and a Raphael and a Leonardo, and we say, wow, this is really great stuff. They must have lived in a golden age. But
So
how
when
golden the stuff is in a museum doesn't necessarily correlate to how good it felt living through it.
So when does the Renaissance acquire a normative golden age status that becomes the pool from which all of these other institutions and ideologies later, lean on it?
Right, because that's 100 to 200 years after we definitely believe the Renaissance is over, right? This is an 18th and 19th century
Okay.
construction, and it's based on the Grand Tour, right?
Ah,
And
yes.
gentlemen from Britain or from Germany or etc. As you're touring, you must tour the continent, and you must go to Venice, and you must go to Florence, and then you head down to Naples and then Constantinople to see all these glorious things and buy them and bring them back for your private collection and strip them away from the places that
Mm.
they were made, and bring them home and prove that you are cultured because you can discuss Italian Renaissance stuff. And it's interesting to remember, paradoxically, that art history is an older academic discipline within the university system than history. Right? History had been practiced a
Right.
bit
Yes.
as a subgenre within the field of ethics, because you study the deeds of great people
Great
to learn
man.
about greatness, and the deeds of wicked people to learn about wickedness. So it was a
Mhm.
subgenre of being an ethicist. But art history then begins as a discipline of, you must understand art and aesthetics in order to be a cultured person and have good taste. And every cozy murder mystery and Sherlock Holmes short story is extremely judgy about the degree of awareness of tasteful architectural choices and tasteful decor of all of the gentlemen, and if they imprudently have ugly instead of beautiful Renaissance tchotchkes in their villa, you know that they're a rotten to the core person whose secrets will come out later in the story. As even Holmes, who Watson describes as having no knowledge of culture or literature, carries a pocket copy of Petrarch's poetry
Yeah.
to read on the train, right? Because even somebody who is indifferent to literature would, of course, read Petrarch. That this is the natural saturate activity of a gentleman, is to have this culturing in Italian culture. And that's an after construction, right? That is the Grand Tour centuries later, going through and seeing the stuff. And then imagining the golden age that must have produced the stuff by seeing the stuff as produce of a golden age and comparing it to, we're about to enter the age of world's fairs, right? And great exhibitions. And thinking, given that today we would say a country must be prosperous and golden if it is producing the kinds of stuff we display on world's fairs, logically, the world that produced the Mona Lisa and the David must have been a prosperous world, not considering the opposite, that they can also be the other thing that makes people do impressive and incredible feats, which is desperation and fear. Right, and the defense mechanism, the moonshot side of what they're doing in the Renaissance. gets lost.
So I have to say, since my field has struggled for decades now to overcome many of the negative biases, right? Starting with the original sin, which is like decline and fall, and
Mhm.
all kinds of like um, all of the negative associations in Orientalism that is like my field. Like we would sacrifice a few authors or a few provincial churches to have the kind of prestige and
Oh yeah.
yeah, yeah. So what are you doing, Ada? I mean, like, why don't you just run with this?
Because I mean, one of the goals I had in writing Inventing the Renaissance is showing why we need historians as a culture.
Yeah.
And one way to show that we need historians is to write histories of, like, hey, here's an entire swath of people that has never had a book published about them in English. But
Mm.
another is to say, here is the most overstudied spot that you can find that has more history books written about it than any other time and place, pretty much. Renaissance Florence. If you compare it to population, there are more books about Rome, but Rome's population was way bigger. So,
Mm.
and so it might not be but it's certainly one of the top four
Oh yeah,
most
for sure.
studied places, right? And to say, here is all the stuff we still don't know and that we've realized we're wrong about and that we're working on fixing, and why we still need new and better histories, even of something of which we have 10,000 histories. Because as we evolve as people, as we improve ethically, as we improve scientifically, we learn how to ask new questions, and we will ask new questions of the same material and therefore come to new conclusions and discover new things.
Yeah.
And you saw how all the way through it, one of the threads of inventing the Renaissance is the, okay, historians as far back as Bruni in the 14 teens are inventing the idea of the Renaissance by inventing a ancient era, medieval era, current era three-part division. Other historians of the Renaissance are continuing this, then the 18th and 19th century historians, and then the early 20th century historians, including my dissertation advisor's dissertation advisor, and then my advisor, and then me, and my colleagues, and my students. And so, just as there are anecdotes about Petrarch's life and Machiavelli's life, there are anecdotes about my life and my experiences at conferences and what my students are doing, showing that the process of inventing the Renaissance is an ongoing and rich
Mm.
and dynamic process that has been going on for 450 years and is going to continue to yield rich fruits even as it continues for another century, 2 centuries, because the act of making meaning and interpretation out of the past is continually rich. And one of my hopes is that by demonstrating this with a topic a lot of people find sexy, the Renaissance, they'll be also open-minded to understanding why we constantly come up with new histories of Ireland and new histories of Africa and new histories of bits of America. That the constant process of improving the questions we ask, even of the same material, in addition to bringing in new material, is vital.
Yeah. Because, one of the flip sides of creating a golden age is that it then becomes a yardstick, also by which other civilizations are measured.
Right.
And yeah, so there's a distortion that this inflicts on the people you study. But it's
Yeah.
also a distortion that is inflicted on people you may not even have heard of, whose literature, whose engagement with the classics, whose architecture is always being held up to, yeah, it's good for their time, but it's not quite like the Renaissance.
Mm.
And like in my field in particular, we're always having to say in advance, no Renaissance was needed here. They had never lost touch with
Right.
ancient Greek texts. They didn't need to rediscover anything. The rhetorical culture was always, trying to recreate that level of, in your field it would be Latinity, in mine it would be Hellenism, and they were actually pretty good at it. And
Yep.
so, like, it never occurred to them, oh,
Yeah.
we're so terrible that we need to.
But it's part of how my students are always imagining that when we say the rediscovery of the classics, we mean Indiana Jones is breaking open a tomb and pulling the dusty tome out of the coffin of the Crusader Knight, right? And when I say no, actually the decades were just in libraries in Constantinople. What you needed was a cultural movement that made people bother to go there and ask to learn Greek and read them and copy them and bring them back.
Yes.
The ones in Constantinople, the ones in Switzerland, the ones all over, right? They could have done this at any time. There's no technological.
They could always have learned. Yeah.
They just decided this was the moment that had a cultural demand for change, and therefore it reaches out. And I use the moonshot comparison very deliberate, right? There's a moment that comes in Petrarch is the most famous articulator of it, when Italy is feeling extremely vulnerable. These northern Italian city republics, which are really wealthy because of banking, and so they have literal piles of gold in the basements of their rich merchant families, and they have tiny populations because they have no big kingdoms around them, right? They have small territories, so they only have tiny armies, or they can hire mercenary armies, but mercenary armies aren't reliable. And also, all these cities hate their neighbors because they're living in the plot of Romeo and Juliet, and the Montagues want to kill the Capulets and vice versa. So if an army marches in to get you, all of your neighbors will be like, yeah, burn them. No one will come help you, right? And this is happening. And so they're watching these cities get sacked or overthrown or taken from inside by a coup, or from outside when a successful mercenary commander gets to middle age and wants to retire, and then picks out on the map, like choosing
which city,
breakfast cereal from the shelf, which city he wants to take over and make himself Duke of as he retires. Right? And this sense of apocalyptic danger to which no military solution is available makes them reach for the culture solution and say, what if we can reconstruct the methods that made ancient Rome stable and reliable, and having rulers that were willing to self-sacrifice for the state, instead of, as soon as Romeo knifes somebody in the street, his dad immediately demands there be no meaningful consequences for this deed, right? The comparison between living in the plot of Romeo and Juliet and reading about the Roman Brutus, who, when his sons tried to take over Rome, executed his own sons, was, this is what we need. We need to do that and become like that in our moment of crisis. And that's when they spend money on sending the boats to Constantinople and trying to learn these things and bring them back, because they felt like they needed them. And earlier, in what we call the Middle Ages, they didn't feel like they needed them because they thought stuff was pretty okay. Things were better in the Middle Ages, Dark Age, right? So they didn't feel they needed a revolutionary change. They didn't have a Renaissance because things were great. They had a Renaissance because things were terrible.
Yeah, the things they wanted from Constantinople earlier were like relics and sacred texts, and those they got plenty in 1204.
They also wanted the porphyry and
they
knew what they wanted.
They did,
but they didn't want Plato, they didn't want Homer, they didn't want Aristotle.
The same sort of thing is happening on my end at the same time, because like around 1400 in Constantinople, they know by that point, okay, we're not going to beat the Turks militarily. We're not even going to be able to beat, a few decades ago, the Serbs or anything like that. And how are we going to get help from the West? Well, we'll dangle union, right, in their eyes, but also we're going to use cultural power. And so we send we know that these Italians are now interested in Greek for some reason. And so we're going to send teachers and manuscripts. And they do that. That's the kind of soft power. And it looks like these two approaches kind of shook their hands over, the Adriatic or something. And they complemented each other.
This is going to sound irrelevant. I have to ask you whether you've seen the 2008 The Conclave movie, the one that's about the 1458 election with Piccolo.
No, I saw the recent one.
No. So this is a Canadian-German film about the papal election of 1458, which has got Cardinal Bessarion and Isidore of Kiev.
No way.
Yeah. and has Piccolomini played by Brian Blessed, no less. And it is the best and worst history film I've ever seen, because they do not explain anything. They never even say who Cardinal Bessarion is.
Does he have a beard at least?
Oh yeah, yeah. He's
Okay.
got the beard. He's good.
Okay.
He's got the beard. He looks Bessarion. He doesn't have the dog, but he's very Bessarion. He makes a lovely speech about the importance of defending Constantinople, right? But
Awesome.
they do not explain anything. And here are the Orsini and Colonna fighting in the streets, and they're like, we're not going to bother to explain this. Obviously, our audience already knows who the Orsini and Colonna are. It's like unwatchable if you're not actually an expert in the field.
I'll watch it.
You are. It's magnificent. And it has all this foreshadowing of young Rodrigo Borgia, young Giuliano della Rovere. It's the best example I've ever seen of a totally brilliant, complete failure of a film.
Okay, so at least I won't be saying unnecessary exposition.
Yeah. There is no exposition. It desperately needs exposition.
Okay.
I think Bessarion explaining that Constantinople fell is probably the only exposition it ever has. Like, at one point, somebody brings up the French claim to the throne of Naples without explaining it. And then they just talk about it for 2 seconds, and then they move on. And you're like, yep, because everyone, of course, already knows about the French claim to Naples in the 1450s.
Okay, this movie must be a playground for you. I can tell why you're saying, okay.
It is so fun and ridiculous. But
yeah.
it's also a neat reflection of the way Byzantium gets talked about, in the fall of Byzantium gets talked about in the Renaissance, right? Because the Renaissance, Renaissance Italians don't help, but they're constantly rhetoricking about helping Constantinople, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's really a 50-year period where the humanists are writing speech after speech about how important it is to revive Constantinople, and popes and kings are presenting themselves as, planning to go help Constantinople, having parades and showing off all of their stuff of going. And then meanwhile, Andres Paleologos, emperor in exile, is literally starving to death in the streets of Rome because nobody will give him money to live on. As they make so much use of the rhetorical imagining of, yes, we will restore the thing. No, we will not.
It was a great topic for speeches.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh. So it's really great seeing people make those speeches in the film, and you're like, you can so tell you're not going to keep this promise at all. And Bessarion is like, I can so tell you're not going to keep this promise at all.
No, he tried.
But it's a neat example of how it's hard telling stories about these moments of political complexity, because it's hard to thread the needle between way too much exposition and oversimplification. And oversimplification is where Dark Age, Golden Age is such a convenient thing to stick in, right? And so when people do a Renaissance movie and they don't want to try to explain to us the French claim to Naples or the Orsini Colonna feud and the 15 other things and who Cardinal Bessarion is, they're like, that's too much. What do? We do Dark Age, Golden Age because that's easy, right? Okay. And I think with Byzantium, we do decadence and decline and fall. So it's way easier than explaining the branches of the imperial family and why Venice sacked it, which never makes any sense because it didn't make any sense originally. And the real history is way too baroque and twisty and also not plausible. And a golden age is plausible, and a decline and fall is plausible. And what really happened isn't plausible. And that's one of the great challenges as a storyteller, whether you're writing fiction or nonfiction, if you're using real history, is how to make what actually happened plausible, when often it really isn't.
Well, you are a great storyteller, and I was actually paying attention to this when reading your book, because you use case studies and the lives of individuals here and there to illustrate and illuminate exactly that complexity. There are a lot of people in there, and they come alive. In particular, I think you do this well, and I'm sort of speaking as a reader of your book now, so I'm sort of characterizing it. But I got the sense that your characters come alive because you present the range of choices. Some choices we just don't have, but you kind of lay out, well, here are the kinds of choices that a person in this position might have made, and some are more plausible, some are riskier, some are whatever, and I think you kind of situate them in that. And I think it's by understanding the range of choices and not by psychologizing them, which I don't like it when historians do that. And anyway,
Right.
the Gibbon
Yeah,
doesn't
because
want.
we don't know what the person was thinking,
No,
but
no,
we do
no.
know what
Yeah,
the five things were that they
right.
might have chosen to do. And
Yeah,
if you're a young man growing up, do you go into the church? Do you become a mercenary? If you become a mercenary, do you work for the Pope or do you work for the Duke of Milan?
yeah, yeah.
We
Yeah.
don't know what he was thinking when he chooses Pope, but we do know what the array before him is when he chooses.
Right. And I think that's how you understand an age, right? It's like when you know what the range of the possible was for a person in that situation. And of course, they all were in different situations. But yeah, yeah. So I think that's my sense, at least, of how you thread that needle. And I think it works. But, it's a long book. Uh, Inevitably, I just wrote a long book too. And that's the trade-off.
I kept offering to the publishers to cut it down. I was like, isn't it too long? And they were like, no, no, it's great. We want
Wait,
it to.
what?
I know this has never happened to anyone ever. I can't explain why I got the backwards bizarro world where they were like, yeah, leave it long, and I was okay. I will. I
Ada,
trust you. This
I had
is.
nightmares about my word count.
Yeah.
It kept
I
me
kept
up.
I kept asking them for a word count. They were like, no, no, just do your thing, and it was magical. I never expected to have this privilege ever again. So I hoped I used wisely the ability to have a big fat book for once. But and that's why it's able to weave so many threads together, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, for
And
sure. Yeah.
and why it's able to spend the beginning introducing, what are our ideas of the Renaissance in the 20th century and the 21st century before we get a portrait of what do I think the Renaissance is, and then the interwoven section of the different characters' lives
Mm.
crisscrossing, and then return to and what are historians saying about all of these people now that we've met them, right? That's a luxuriant multi-stage analysis where
Yeah.
we analyze the analysis so that we introduce a new thing that is a privilege to get to write, and very few publishers will put out a book that has that much in it
Yeah.
because word count makes things more expensive. So I was really delighted and surprised to have that privilege and tried to use it well.
Well, I'm glad you had that chance too. I enjoyed it. So there's another issue that I wanted to raise here, because I say it comes early in the book, by which I mean the first tenth. And this is about the kind of privileged position that Florence occupies in our imagination of the Renaissance.
Yeah.
And this was a passage where I was like underlining almost everything, and it was like, okay, it's about like 4 or 5 pages, and that really jumped out at me
Mhm.
because, and I'll ask you to explain it,
This
in a
is the
moment.
Florence, the self-reinforcing source base,
Yes,
right?
yes.
Yeah.
Because the same sort of thing has happened in other fields as well, and yet those fields don't know that they're working with material that has been selected in ways, and for reasons that are invisible.
Right.
Classics is one of those fields.
Mm.
In many areas, not all. Sometimes texts survive through random reasons, but in many reasons there are structural reasons why we have what we have and we don't have what we don't have.
Yeah.
But my field is the same, because like once it was all conquered by the Ottomans. The Ottomans had a preference for governing their subjects through their religious institutions and not their political institutions, which are far more dangerous. And so
Mhm.
they allowed churches and monasteries to survive, and that meant the books and the resource and whatever that churches and monasteries have, and none of the secular institutions, not a single one of which survived. And
Right.
which meant also their archives and their libraries and their right. And so very quickly, when the church becomes the sole sort of inheritor of that civilization, it gets skewed in that direction, with the result that today many people just kind of identify, quote, Byzantium with the Orthodox Church, as if those are the same thing. But
Right.
this is a process of selection that was
Mhm.
political. All
Yeah.
right, so tell us about Florence.
Well, and the what we're bringing up is the general principle that for us to still have something, except for the oddball things that like ended up falling in a tomb, for us to still have something means every generation between when it was made and now
Exactly.
made a choice to preserve it.
Right. Yes.
And any moment of disruption to that process can mean we don't have it. And earlier generations of historians who were very excited to study what we've got didn't yet do a lot of asking of, okay, what is missing that we don't have? And so, we notice things like Renaissance Florence has this giant, enormous archive of textual material, right? We've got every historian who works on anything pre-modern shivers when I say this one. We have 30 million pages of documentation about the funding of the building of the cathedral.
What? What? What do you mean?
We have so much stuff in Florence, and every receipt for candle wax and baptismal record and letter back and forth, and not just the important stately letters that get collected, right? We have one of my favorite letters ever, which is, "Dear Mom, I left my favorite purple bathrobe at home. Please bring it when you come. Sincerely, Lorenzo de Medici."
Okay.
Which survives only when you keep every piece of paper and not when you do any curation process of any kind, because nobody would ever decide to keep that. But Florence still has everything. And so historians are like, oh, great, Florence is so civilized, they kept everything, we will study them and use them as the example, without thinking that, wait a minute, if one place has 100 times as much surviving documentation as any other place, that definitionally means that place is weird and an outlier. And we have to factor in the outlierness and ask the question, why does it have all this documentation? And what makes it weird, and therefore what is atypical about it? And anything we find from the hyper-documented place will definitionally be wrong for everywhere else. And we have to try to figure out what it is. And then core to this is Florence has always been protected and treated with kid gloves by every regime that has ever had it. This is a microcosm of Italy in general. And Italy Italy in general, in the historical record, except very, very, very early, has never been conquered by anybody who didn't already respect and treasure Italy's culture and want it.
Yes, thank you.
Italy is a beautiful jewel box, and you want to keep it exactly as it is and put it in a plexiglass case and put it on your mantelpiece. And you get treated totally differently when the conqueror respects and wants to have your culture undisturbed from when you're conquered by somebody who wants to change your culture, replace your culture, overwrite your culture, alter your culture, whatever.
Though it does turn you into a museum.
Exactly. And so, when it's under Habsburg rule, when the Nazis are there, when the Allies are bombing, every stage of Italy is always, oh no, you absolutely mustn't hurt our cultural stuff. You'd be a monster if you hurt the cultural stuff, which is why, Florence is only bombed once by the Allies in the entirety of World War II. It is a daylight mission, which they almost never did. Just to hit the train station with this absolutely desperate order of one bomb, one run, train station only. Otherwise, if we scratch
yes.
al fresco in Florence, we're monsters forever. Don't do it. And every stage, whether it's the Napoleonic Wars, like you name it, Florence was, well, we can't possibly hurt the art place. We would be barbarians if we hurt Florence. And so Florence has this protection inherited from the fact that its original defense mechanism back in the Renaissance was art. Yeah. Because Florence has, no meaningful armies, no way to have them. And after it executes its nobility and makes its wonky merchant republic, which is I love, but is also nuts by the political thinking of the period, right? They execute everybody with noble blood. And they set up this merchant republic with only merchant class people. And that means they effectively, from the point of view of the entire rest of the world, don't exist, right? The nobility are the political class. You can't even have an ambassador from Florence because an ambassador has to have noble blood. So there are these amazing negotiations at one point over the wool trade, which are between England and Florence. But the way they work is that the king has to send a servant down to the docks to see whether there is an exiled Florentine hanging out. to send this message to this stupid merchant republic, which has no human beings. It has only merchants, right? And of course, Florence also has this reputation for perversion and sodomy, and the verb to Florentine means anal sex in 6 European languages. Right. So this is the unrivaled pit of scum and villainy that you walk into. And how does it defend itself? Right? How does it defend itself? It's playing Civ. It knows that you can do the culture victory, or inverting that. This is what the Civ culture victory is based on. Right. So the way I like to describe this is this. Let's imagine that you are an ambassador. You're from Burgundy. You're on your way to Rome to congratulate the new pope on behalf of the Duke of Burgundy. And it's your job to get there and present a gift and give an oration that says long-windedly, I come from a mighty ruler and he's so glad you're the pope. Congratulations. Everybody has to send an envoy to do this. And you're on your way, and one of the stops on the road is Florence, where you have to change horses and spend the night. And you're not looking forward to this because there's nobody in the whole city of worthy rank to host you, right? Like they're all equal in rank to your valet, not you. And they're all perverts, right? So, and you come over the hill, and there's this really amazing dome, and you're like, wow, I've only seen much smaller versions of that, and I know how hard it was that the dome a fifth that size is the engineering marvel of our city. What even is that? And then you get into the city, and there are these bronze statues that look like they're about to come to life. They're so vivid and realistic, and you've never seen anything like that, right? You've seen sort of stiff stylized statues. Maybe you've seen the broken off hand of an ancient Roman statue somewhere, right? Mm-hmm. But this is brand new, and it's incredible. And then you get to the house of your dad's banker, who is the person you're staying with for the night, because you at least know his name and his address. And he's expecting you, and he greets you humbly at the door, and he apologizes that he's not of worthy status to host your excellency. And you're like, yeah, that's true, but whatever. And he invites you into his humble merchant home, and you go inside, and suddenly, beautiful white light is streaming through these rounded arches in this luminous courtyard that looks like nothing you've ever seen before. Wait, no, it does. It looks like the Roman ruins in the backyard of the castle where you grew up, but that's not possible. Nobody knows how to build that. So how is it here? Mm-hmm. And there are more bronze statues in the courtyard, some of which are naked boys who are really sexy and distracting. And around the edges of the courtyard are busts of all the Roman emperors in order. And above them are portraits of this dude and all of the members of his family. And in the corner are some guys, speaking a language you've never heard before, walking around in weird robes. And you're like, who are those guys? And your host says, oh, they're Platonists. They're speaking ancient Greek. We have lots of Plato here. Here, look, here's my grandson, Lorenzo. He's just composed a poem in ancient Greek about the 3 parts of the soul. Would you like to hear him recite it? And now there's a little boy reciting a poem at you in ancient Greek. And you're like, but we don't have any of these things. Plato doesn't exist. And ancient Greek doesn't exist. And this building doesn't exist. How is any of this possible? Mm-hmm. And that's the moment at which Cosimo de' Medici turns to you and says, do you want to make an alliance with Florence? Right? Mm-hmm. And you can say no. You can say, we're going to bring the armies of Burgundy and France down across the Alps to go a-sacking. And we're going to sack this. We're going to take all the piles of gold out of your basements. And all of this will be gone. Or you could say, yes, let's make an alliance. Send me an architect, a blacksmith, and a Greek scholar.
And a Platonist.
Platonist. And we're going to do the court in Burgundy like this. And the next time there's an imperial election or a French ambassador, we're going to look amazing. And they're going to feel like uncultured bumpkins like I feel right now.
Right.
So nobody wants to hurt this because everybody wants the goose to keep laying golden eggs.
Yes.
And this keeps being the defense mechanism by which Florence defends itself, not only in the Renaissance, but in the next century and in the 18th century and in the 9th century and in World War I and in World War II, that, the whole idea of a UNESCO World Heritage Site, right, is for things like this, where we say only a barbarian would ever hurt Florence. And so that means all the stuff is saved. and everybody flies in and protects it. And there was a great juxtaposition when there was the Great Flood in the 60s. There was a major flood in Florence, and everything up to the second stories got drenched. And every art historian and amateur art historian on earth was on a plane immediately and descended upon Florence and the vastest army of restoration people, every professor, every retired old British lady who loved Renaissance art, right? They all painstakingly hung every page of manuscript paper up on clotheslines all across the city and painstakingly washed the mud out of every church. And not long after that, there was a major earthquake in Assisi that did terrible damage to the jaw and crickets. Nobody cared. Nobody helped. Right, they were hoping that the same love would descend from the world upon them to save them, and just nowhere has that clout. Maybe Paris, maybe Rome, Constantinople should, but I suspect if a flood on the same level happened, no, it would not be the case that every art historian and old retired British lady in the world would descend upon the city to save it. Right, Florence has this charisma. It played the culture card to the very maximum, and it got multiplied over the centuries of it being the place you go on the grand tour to see this culture. And as a result, it has all this paperwork that existed everywhere else, but is there. And it's helped by the fact that the last heiress of the Medici family, who was really smart and really legally prudent, wrote a will leaving all of the family treasures to the city of Florence on condition that they may never leave the city of Florence. So Florence cannot sell them. And other cities like Siena and Pisa and Milan, whenever there's a crisis, the city will be like, well, we can fix the sewer system if we sell a Raphael. And so they sell the Raphaels, but Florence can't. It would have if it could have, but it can't. So all the stuff is still there through entail and belongs to the city, which has also helped. But that doesn't, protect the receipt for candle wax. That just protects the Medici treasures, which therefore are there. But other things have joined them and creates this distorting source space where you visit Florence and you fall in love with it. And you're like, I feel like I've stepped into a time machine and come out in the Renaissance, and it's so beautiful, it's so amazing. And you see it and you feel it in your heart, and you're like, this was a golden age. But that is the construction of subsequent centuries built upon this Florence, like a lizard flapping its dewlap to defend itself, and you get predators to be distracted and confused, right? Florence flashing its Michelangelo and its Leonardo at you to be like, please don't eat me. I have art. And everyone be like, oh, I don't want to eat that. It has art.
Yeah, that is a wonderfully evocative description. And the way you put it, I realized just how much, we don't have on my side of things. And it's not for lack of Constantinople, having the same kind of impressive effect on Western visitors that went there. Not only was it impressive in terms of its architecture and learning and all of that, but they actually did have higher ranked people and emperors that you bow to and all that. And yet,
and it was on the grand tour. But I think the one of the things that Byzantium always faced was narratives of how this fell and is lost are the narratively satisfying bit.
Yeah, that's right.
And whether it's, it was broken by the Venetians in the sack, right? Or later when the Turks took it. But, so even while Byzantium is there and thriving and still exists, Europe is already making use of but really it was broken by the Venetian sack and isn't what it was. And, we can have nostalgia for it. And so you almost want Byzantium, you want to come to Constantinople and see it and think, this isn't what it used to be. The stuff is gone, right?
Transient glory.
Want to see ruins. Ruins are the narratively satisfying completion of the narrative.
Yeah, that's right.
And so it doesn't get protected the same way because people will always say, but all the best stuff is already lost. So it's just a small blow to the ruins of what were there.
Yeah.
And therefore it doesn't get that same protection because rhetorically it is the ruin in the same way that rhetorically Florence is the preserved time capsule.
Yeah. Or the stuff that it did manage to preserve. moved to Italy, and we have it from there. And so, no great loss.
Yep.
Yeah, these there's a kind of dialectic between these two fields, and I think that's a great place to wrap this up because we could go on talking about. I mean, you bring up so many topics in the book that I would like to discuss. I wanted to kind of corner you and ask you. So, what do you think the Renaissance was in the end? But you don't have a short answer to that, by the way.
No, I don't have a short answer, except in as much as I think it was the beginning of a trend which has remained ever since, of Europe facing crisis and saying, we want to deliberately change society. The solution to this is not military investment or prayer, it's changing our culture, right? And the moment when Petrarch and his peers say, Italy is in chaos and weakness right now, the solution to that is to get the books and reassemble the library that raised Augustus Caesar and raised Cicero and raised Seneca and raised these great statesmen. And that will change what our political class is and how it acts. And we will no longer be in Romeo and Juliet. We will be in a Roman play, forgetting that the Roman plays are almost all tragedies. We'll be in a Roman comedy instead of in Romeo and Juliet, right? That is the dream. Mm-hmm. The Pax Romana is the dream, right? They're not thinking about Tiberius and Caligula and the orgies the way HBO series are. They're thinking about the period of peace under the good gay emperors, right? Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, like that one patch, the only recorded period of extended peace in Italian history, when you could walk in peace with a bag of gold safely from the north coast of France all the way to Turkey, and on streets that don't have bandits on them. And that's their dream. And they're saying the way we get to that is educational reform and culture.
Proper Latin.
Read the books, we imitate the behaviors, we raise the young statesmen, we get them to have these virtues. And it failed, right? They try this, they work at it for a century, and it produces Cesare Borgia and everything burns down, right? It doesn't make peace, but it does make this momentum of the idea that if we want a better world, what do? We build libraries. And we improve education and we get the books and we compare them to each other and we try to inquire more about the world. And these are the libraries that enable the scientific discoveries and questionings of the late 16th and then 17th centuries and the period we problematically call the scientific revolution and the beginnings of the Enlightenment. Ever since then, Europe has often said, there's a problem. How do we solve it? Let's do education. And when America is founded and the American experiment begins and the founding fathers say, and one thing we need is universal public education, because a democratic experiment will only work with a well-informed populace. We will therefore implement universal education. That is the descendant of the idea that you change the world through education and library building and direct and intentional cultural self-transformation.
Yeah.
And that's something Europe has been trying to do, and the world now has been trying to do deliberately ever since. And there were patches, I think, when different populations or individual cities or individual kingdoms would be like, we're going to have a religious explosion right now, and we're going to, but not contiguously, right? And I think the contiguousness of it is an important part of what Renaissance begins. That it begins this, we can also almost call it the beginning of the idea of social engineering.
The plan. They have a plan.
Right? We have a plan, we implement it. None of these plans ever work in that they never produce the world the people who started it imagined. But they also do work in that they produce changes on the more long term that are what they imagined. As I close reflecting on this, the question of if you asked Petrarch, did the Renaissance succeed or fail? He wouldn't want the answer after the 100 years, which is where Machiavelli and Cesare Borgia are like, everything is terrible, because that's not the duration of time that somebody of his era thinks about, right? This is the era of cathedral thinking. Of we build the foundation and then the next generation builds the bottom of the wall and the next generation builds the middle, and where a big project like remaking the world in virtue's image is going to take 500 years, right? Florence
is still out. what you're
was
saying.
started around the time this was. Florence's
Yeah,
cathedral is
yeah.
done. Milan's cathedral was finished like 5 years ago. Good job, Milan. Florence isn't done. And if we think about the fruits of that effort to transform, and that it did produce democracy, universal education, amazing innovations in health, vaccines, right? You go back in time and tell Petrarch that in 500 years, Florence hasn't burned to the ground yet, and the Black Death is curable, and ask him, did it succeed? He'll say, beyond my wildest dreams, it succeeded.
Yes.
They never thought they would be able to take on the Dread Horseman plague, only possibly reduce the Dread Horseman War.
Well, that's a message of hope.
There's one thing I really want to bounce off of Byzantinists, so I will
Okay.
ask selfishly for another 5 minutes. Okay, I think one of the problems with the way we think about time that I think really affects Byzantium and also affects Middle Ages and Renaissance is that the way we're taught to think about it is to think of time periods almost as a setting, right? In terms of the setting in which a television show would take place.
Mm-hmm.
And that all settings are equally sort of long and equally real.
Mm-hmm.
And this feeds into the illusion that is perpetrated by many a timeline on the wall of a classroom that history changes faster in the present than it did in the past. Right? Remember how many timelines have every decade of the 20th century
Mm-hmm.
stretched out to be as big as a century earlier. And if I go to a TV network and I'm pitching a TV show and it's about Constantine, they'll say, oh, but we're doing a show about Augustus. It's the same setting. So we won't do a Constantine show at the same time, even though it's centuries apart.
Mm-hmm.
But if I go to a TV network and pitch a World War I show and they have a Roaring Twenties show, they'll be like, yeah, Roaring Twenties is a different era from World War I and a different setting and therefore different. And you get these odd kinds of rhetoric, especially in the business world, though also adjacent to, for example, Trumpism, where they'll say, you know, we're going to dismantle this part of the economy and we're going to have a brief dark age. And then it's going to bring about a golden age. And you say, well, how long do you expect a dark age and a golden age to last? And they're like, well, 5 years, maybe 10. That's how long the dark ages are, right? Because I think people do feel like that. People have been taught that an era is 5 to 10 years in modernity and was 5 to 10 centuries, right? In the past, the Byzantium is one time period, which is why it's so hard to get people to realize that it lasts 1,000 years. And people are just never ready for the fact that Byzantium is, yep, still there. Yep, still there. Yep, I was there then too. Yep, it was there then too.
It's interesting.
They want it to be one time period.
It's interesting that you would frame it in those terms because, as it happens, I am in contact with maybe about half a dozen people who are writing screenplays. These are aspirational projects. I have no reason to think that there's a studio involved, but I'm happy to help. Like this is my expertise. I can't help you with the drama and the characters and the plot, and like that's all on you. But if you want the historical grounding, I can help with that. And these are questions that come up because they don't know how to script the sort of ambient environment in a way that, say, a studio or an audience would understand. It was exactly what you said. Is Constantine's era supposed to look like Caesar's? Like, is that the shorthand so that we convey, Roman Empire, more or less, you get it?
Yeah, I mean, togas, pediments, marble buildings, people in the Roman tunics, the two stripes, it looks the same.
Yeah, because some of that was still around, but there was a lot of very distinctive new stuff that isn't culturally coded.
Right.
And so, it scares studios because it's like an unknown period. It's whatever. Or later, when it's supposed to have a more sort of deep Byzantine, it's lots of mosaics and cowls and, it's Orthodox chanting and mysticism and all of this stuff. Or even later, when it's like basically late Western medieval, you've got Italians and Crusaders and, it's all of this stuff, fights with Saracens and this kind of, so it's much more Western medieval coded in that way.
Right.
And they have a real problem in choosing, quote, the period. for precisely that reason, right?
Because they want it to be one period and they struggle when it's many.
Yes.
Right?
Or if it's just not, it doesn't correspond to any stereotypes that they expect the audience to know.
Right.
And how do you convey, like even just, for example, just calling them Romans, which is what would have been taking place in the culture itself,
Yep.
is like, the audience will be confused. Well, yeah, well, this is the task. This is the challenge. Can you educate the audience?
And we get the audience to wrap their head around it, right?
Yes.
And there's only a finite amount of narrative work that you're ready to ask of the viewer / reader.
Yes.
Because this is also true of prose fiction.
Yeah.
And you have to decide how much of that narrative work do I want to invest in getting them to understand Byzantines call themselves Romans? Or do I want to have that narrative work in them keeping my 4 characters straight?
Yep. Yeah. So you have this crazy interference between what you were calling earlier, like the periods. If it's Romans, you've got these Roman armies. By the way, they have flamethrowers also in this period, which is kind of wild. But then also, if you have classical scholarship, then it starts to look a little Renaissance-y, and it's like, I don't know, we don't want to. So there's a lot of confusion here for precisely this reason.
Yep.
Anyway, yeah.
So how do we deal with the one setting is one time period? We want it to be homogeneous problem, and the way that affects people's imagination of the present, right? And people are like, but every decade I've lived through has felt totally different. And I'm like, yeah, read Machiavelli's letters. Every decade he lived through felt totally different too. I think it is interesting to ask the question. It would be neat and possibly useful for there to be less believing that every decade is equal to the entirety of Byzantium, right? And the entirety of Renaissance, the entirety of the Middle Ages, for people to recognize more of this. And when I do my biographical subsections of the book, you saw how I work to try to establish time, right? And point out that when people say the Renaissance was shaped by the birth of nationalism and the works of Petrarch and Machiavelli, that Petrarch and Machiavelli are as far apart in time as Napoleon's childhood to Yuri Gagarin's space flight. So if we said something happened twice, once when Napoleon was a boy and once when Yuri Gagarin was in orbit, we would not say that this happened at the same time and was one moment. We would say a whole lot of stuff happened in between. Come back in on that.
I love arguments that are in my field, like really, really technical, granular arguments that are like, that was so 1030s, this would never have happened in the 1040s.
Yep. Because it's always been true, just as things that would happen in the 20-aughts wouldn't happen in the 20-teens and the 2020s. And if we can get people to realize that, and that the world today is not more complicated than the past, that's one key to getting people to realize that the feeling of apocalypse a lot of people have right now is also not new.
Oh, no.
People felt like they were living in the apocalypse in the 1490s and in the 1530s and certainly in the 1520s. And also, Shakespeare gripes a lot about fake news and has rants about fake news.
Fake news.
If they feel like they're living in the apocalypse. Everybody feels like it's the apocalypse when it's the most politically frightening decade we have personally witnessed.
Right.
That doesn't mean the whole rest of the world was okay until now and we face the apocalypse.
Agreed.
Their apocalypse is about twice a century. And they are the decade that feels like the worst decade that generation has seen.
Yeah. It's always been, I'm actually thinking of doing an episode on fake news, just to remind people, like the whole French Revolution was just one piece of fake news after another that got people really worked up, but whatever. Okay. Ada, thank you so much.
This was a treat.
It was, and for writing the book and for coming onto the podcast. And I will, I want to do something on teaching and pedagogy at some point, but
maybe we could talk again about teaching. That'd be great. Awesome.
You are definitely the person to do that with. So thank you again and take care.